Audio.
A quick thanks before we start the show. Filmmaking Confidential, the book, is now an Amazon.com and Audible.com bestseller. I just want to say thank you to all of you who ordered it and for your support. If you haven't yet picked it up and you want to learn my filmmaking secrets, Filmmaking Confidential is for you. It's available wherever books are sold in most countries around the world. Order by visiting Audible or Amazon. To find out more, check out filmmakingconfidential.com and stevebalderson.com. Thank you. I'm Steve Balderson, and you're listening to the Filmmaking Confidential podcast. In this podcast, we meet with filmmakers, writers, actors, artists, and other notables. Today's guest is one of my favorite actresses and closest friends, Susan Traylor. Susan is the daughter of legendary acting teachers Peggy Feury and William Traylor. Their school, the Loft Studio, served as a second home to Susan. At 15, Susan studied acting with her parents and continued her formal education by going to film school at NYU. Susan has worked with some of the greatest directors of our time, like Gus Van Sant, Robert Redford, and Michael Mann. She also wrote, directed, produced, and starred in an incredible independent film called Welcome to California. She's also been in a number of my films.
I also really like eating the same food as the person I'm eating with. Like, I think it's like a really kind of unifying thing.
What, the same plate or the same dish or the same order?
No, just the same food. Like I like ordering together. Like even if you're in a restaurant, I like, oh, what should we have? Like it just seems to be a nicer meal if you're eating. I feel more connected to the people who you're eating the same food with.
Totally, because you're all having the same sensations.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. It really makes sense. Like I hate having a drink with somebody who doesn't have a drink.
Right.
Or I'm uncomfortable. Also same not drinking when people are drinking. You know what I mean? It's kind of nice to be in sync with people. I mean, not that you can't handle yourself if you're not, but.
Right. No, I love that.
There's something, it just makes it a little bit more, celebratory too. It's like, oh, this is what, oh God, did you taste that? I
remember when I had a glass of champagne with Jennifer Dreiling and she told me about the monks who invented it. And he said, come quick, I'm tasting stars.
Oh my God. What a beautiful story.
Yeah. But then at the same time, it's like you can have that experience with someone.
We are tasting stars. And when you get that connection, you don't need to have a whole lot more sips, right? Because you're just like, oh, so now that's alive between the two of you. It's a different form of a conversation.
Totally. When you were growing up in a creative family, were you aware that was unusual?
That's a great question, Steve. I grew up on a street I was born in New York City, right? And my parents were actors and acting teachers. My father came out here to do a movie. And while he was out here doing the movie, I was 2 years old. Lee Strasberg asked my mother if she'd like to come out, that he was going to open a school here. And he was only going to be here some months of the year. And would she like to be sort of the resident teacher there? And so she packed my sister and I up and surprised my father and just said, we're here. My father was staying at my, quote, Uncle Bill's house on the PCH, Bill Jordan, fantastic man. And he said to me as an adult now, long after my father died, oh, your father wasn't half as much fun once you all arrived. But anyway, so we were staying on the PCH in Malibu, and Susan Strasberg, who was Lee Strasberg's daughter and a great friend of my parents, and had a daughter my age who became one of my best friends in life. She went to Rome to do a movie. So she said, stay in my house in the colony, Malibu colony. And so we went and stayed in her house. And my parents liked it so much that we got a house of our own just down the street. And so we all lived there together. And the great thing about the colony was there were a bunch of people, a few families that had moved out there after the Bel Air fires. They relocated their families to Malibu. And then there was still, you know, like Herbie Babineau, who is the construction, you know, is the main contractor in Malibu. And do you know what I mean? There were all different kind of families there. Our orthodontist lived down the street, but it was a wonderful place to grow up because there were all kinds of people, and a lot of people with children. So we would all be roaming in and out of each other's houses, right? And there were a lot of creative, people of all sorts, singers, directors, actors, and people who would come and go because it was a beach house, right? And so we were always there. And there were people who would live there for a few years, or people who would come for the summer. But it's not like today where beach houses, people, like, they're all empty most of the time. Like, everybody was in the houses all the time. The streets were full of kids going on their bikes. But because we came from New York, and my parents came from my mother came from the group theater, and then my parents met at the Actors Studio. All the sort of New York crowd of their friends who were actors, writers, playwrights, directors, when they came to Los Angeles, many of them would say, well, we make a beeline for the Traylors because it was the only house in California that had books in it.
Amazing.
And so I feel really lucky for that, because Malibu was really out there at that time. And a lot of my friends who had very creative parents, and then there were, a lot of the other kids who, like, that was very foreign to them, and they never got out of Malibu. I mean, I was taken into town to sit in acting class and watch theater all the time. And all of that came out to us because we lived in Malibu. So on weekends, on Sundays, we'd often have play readings and our, brunches and play readings in the backyard, or people just to come to tell stories from abroad. And it was really pretty extraordinary, but I watched, and because my parents were acting teachers, people would come to the kitchen and sit there and cry and tell what was going on in their life. So from a very young age, my sister and I got very into sort of talking people through their traumas, and getting to listen to people collaborate on projects. And, one of my best friends, her across the street, her stepfather was Jerome Hellman, the film producer. And, he was working on Coming Home with Hal Ashby, and they would have meetings on the deck. So while we would, be running out to the ocean, you'd kind of go like this just to see how much you could hear. But it wasn't spying. It was just totally part of life. But you were like, oh, that's what they're doing. How is this meeting different than the play meeting or do you know what I mean? And so it was totally it was very much about the process, the way I was raised to really engage in the process, and less so the business of it, and so I feel that was it was really lucky. And then when I was in high school, I went to, from 7th grade to 12th grade, I would drive into town to Bel Air to go to Westlake School for Girls. And then when I was 15, we actually moved to Bel Air to be in town. And, but I do distinctly remember when my father was directing the Michel Tremblay play. He's a Canadian playwright called Hosanna. I remember telling my parents, like, do you get that most of my friends are like, eating dinner at 5 o'clock and doing their homework and going to bed. And I'm sitting here watching rehearsals for Hosanna. There's like, why are you, there's a lot of homework at this school. Are you sure this all adds up? you know? And my
That's amazing.
parents told me, they said, well, you know, Susan, you have this is part of your whole life. But the test you have to pass at that school will prepare you for a life. You know, they'll give you more freedom in your creative life than you'll ever imagine. So this is just what you need to do now, you know? So I tell you that story only because, you know, there were moments where it did seem at odds, but it was sort of basically all I knew. Do you know what I mean? You know,
Yeah.
some of my friends, several of my friends' parents were writers. And, you know, they would be in their offices writing, and you had to go by their writing hour rules when you were at their house. But it wasn't weird. It was an honor because I'm like so grateful to every one of them for allowing us to see the process. You know, a lot of kids would be like, oh, goodbye, I'm going to work, and you wouldn't see it. But when in this environment that I grew up in, you saw the work. And, you know, I feel lucky that I felt like people were very generous in the community. One might imagine, you know, if one did a sort of a camp revision of it, they might think of this all as narcissism. Oh, we're writing our plays, we're writing our books, we're doing our play. Oh, my character, but actually, I just somehow knew from very young that it was a great honor to be able to see the wheels spinning of people's processes. And because I knew these people personally on a day-to-day basis, how these different processes manifested from these different personalities.
That's so cool.
So, yeah. And I think it's been a great help to me as a director and as an actor. You know, there's no director who directs the movie the same way. Or if you're directing something, there's no actor who has the exact same process. So one of my favorite parts of joining a new ensemble, right, a new project, is kind of getting a grip of how everybody works, you know, and then suddenly you all become one. And it's like so fascinating to me that all these different ways of working can get into one piece and make something together, you know?
Yes, I love that. I'm talking to James Osland tomorrow.
Oh, wow.
And I told him that when I'm casting, it's a little bit for me like the recipe for a dish. And, you know, this person has an ingredient and this other person has their ingredient. And just like what you're saying, and when you bring those particular ingredients together, you get this flavor. And it's going to be different than if you pick those other three ingredients.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a little theoretical.
No, but that's exactly what I'm saying. Totally. That's exactly what I'm saying. I was just taking a pause because I actually met James. He studied acting with my father after my mother had died. And I'd come home and he was sort of a new person who didn't know me before my mom died. And, you know, it was so tragic and sad and sudden that there was something very relieving to find somebody who, you know, wasn't worried you were just going to fall apart at the seams and just sort of saw you as who you were, you know, in the moment. And we worked on Harold Pinter together a lot. And it was, you know, and it was so fun. And I think it's so amazing. He's become this great food critic, and now he writes these amazing cookbooks, and he's also a novelist. But I see his life as an actor come through in everything he does. So this is very interesting that you bring this up.
Did you have this is not even related to, but maybe it is, any family food traditions?
Oh, sure. You know, what was great about when I grew up, you know, we would have brunches, dinners for 30 people, 10, 20, 30 people. And my parents would cook the food. It wasn't like, you know, sort of now if you went to the colony, people would have chefs and, you know, like, and they would do it all. So making the meal would go on all day, you know, and we would, but I'm trying to think of traditions. You know, my mother kind of came from from like the School of Gourmet cookbook. So she would make like boeuf bourguignon and poached salmon on Sundays and veal scallopini, and you know what I mean? And then my dad went, when I was about 10, I think, he went to Italy to do a movie. And when he came back, he really got into making incredible Italian food, although he was, you know, a boy from Huntsville, Missouri, or from Brashear, Missouri, sorry. And, you know, but this new thing came on, and it, you know, it was wonderful, because in Malibu, there were no Italian restaurants at the time, you know.
Amazing.
So that was really exciting. But no, they were all, and you know, there were different people, like Barney Rosenzweig down the street. When his kids would come out for the weekend, he'd make us French toast on the weekends. I mean, there were all those kind of things like that. You know, there were my parents would make us Lund's Swedish pancakes on the weekends, and then I'd have like Quintana's mom would make chicken, and it was Joan Didion, the writer. She'd make, we called it burnt chicken with rosemary, but that's just because it was so perfectly cooked on an iron skillet. But it was like our favorite thing in the world. And we'd be like, can we have burnt chicken with rosemary?
Amazing.
But it's nice because they weren't necessarily cultural traditions, but they were household traditions. And you love to go to these houses. And I had one friend whose family were much more, you know, they had people who lived at their house who would, you know, went to see one of the gurus, you know, who were part of that. And they go to satsangs on weekends, but they would cook for this family a lot. And they'd make big family dishes, which were slightly more, quote, hippie, unquote, you know? And so sometimes I'd be like, I loved, in my mind, I go, "Ooh, I'd love to go to dinner there because they serve goulash." And that was my name for these sort of hippie casseroles.
Well, let's jump into that. Casseroles.
Casseroles.
I mean, we could talk about working together until we're blue in the face, but
yeah.
That was such a special film, The Casserole Club. Do you remember when I sent you the script for it?
That I remember you approaching me. Well, this is interesting because normally it is totally the script that one responds to. But what I remember first is when you explained to me the setup of how you said, "I want to send you the script," but you pitched it with the setup. We're going to be in Palm Springs and we're going to have a couple houses and everybody's going to have to live together, right? I mean, and I had done a couple of your movies before, so this was no surprise to me. But this was slightly different, right? I mean, it was a play on how you normally did it.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, that's fine, but I have to have my own room because I don't know how to work and totally interact with people all day long like that. But then so I was like, oh, that's interesting. Out in the desert, we're going to do this in Palm Springs. And then I read the script. I was so taken by I was so focused on sort of Sugar's journey in, who was my character, was named Sugar, with her journey in that script that I think I was in from the point of, I just sort of got on her ride, sort of, you know, and to sort of figure out how she presented herself and tried to make things go on, but what was internally going on. And just the idea of being out in the desert and being able, you know, next to those great mountains in Palm Springs, knowing that it was a full ensemble piece, but being so secure in knowing that I really, she just jumped into me quickly. You know what I mean? And then it was figuring the external. You know, sometimes you work like, oh, here's the story. Well, what if I tried this? And you work externally inward. Well, she sort of jumped in, and then I had to find out, well, what was her disguise to you know what I mean? What was her costume? Like,
yeah,
not the actor's costume, but her personal costume in life. And how did she how was she trying to protect herself from what was really going on or what she feared was going on. And so I remember that very much from reading the script, but because I had worked with you before and knew how you worked, but then you explained to me this particular setup. I remember her like being clear how this was going to go down. So I just she just kind of went in, you know, and then cool. It was a matter of bringing her back out.
Do you really want to get into this now?
I'm just not so sure why you invited those people into our house. They're not part of our little group.
I mean, they had nothing to do with you and Max Beatum.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, come on, Sugar, be honest. You've been wet for Max since they moved across the street. I know how that deceitful mind of yours works. You couldn't wait to get Max inside you. You planned that party, got us all drunk, so you'd have an excuse to live out your fantasy.
I'll tell you something. You take things and you mess it around. I don't know how to reach you anymore, Connie. I don't know how to talk to you.
You don't know what you're talking about.
Would you like one scoop or would you like two?
I don't want your fucking casserole! I'm sick of it. I'm sick of you. I'm sick of this house. I'm sick of your whiny mouth.
I made you that dinner, Connie. You used to like that dish. You used to love turkey di monstrata. I worked hard to make dinner tonight because I wanted to make you happy. I work hard to make you happy, Connie, and you ruin it! You ruin our dinner! You get drunk, and you get mad, and you ruin everything! You lock yourself in that fucking bathroom, and you go after that... Whatever you do to yourself, Connie! Your leg looks like raw hamburger meat! How am I supposed to love that?
Shut your fucking mouth!
That was Susan Traylor acting opposite Kevin Richardson from the Backstreet Boys in my film, The Casserole Club. We'll be right back with Susan Traylor. Stay with us. I'm Steve Balderson, and this is the Filmmaking Confidential podcast. I'm back with Susan Traylor.
When you get scripts for different projects, is it similar the way you go about it, or is it always different?
Well, I think everything is totally different. I mean, story is what you're kind of always, looking for. But, somehow I really came up playing little tiny parts in big movies. It was a lot of my first jobs in acting. So I was left alone to really build what this person's private life was and all this stuff. So I sometimes I just had to go like, how do I make this whole person fit into that story? Because sometimes I'd have a few lines or you know what I mean? Or I remember I had this bit part in The Bodyguard, right? And I was doing a scene in between Kevin Costner and Whitney Houston, and they were having a big conversation in between me, and I was her dressmaker, right? Her costumer in the movie, right? And so I thought, well, I don't have anything to do in this scene, but I have to be in the room with them the whole time. And so I had to think all about what was all about the activity. I don't know why this one has come to mind, but because I remember, like, a while into the day, Kevin Costner came over. He said, "You are either a really great actress or like a very dumb person because you're working awfully hard." And I was so like, good. Oh yeah, I guess I got this. I can relax a little.
That's amazing. And then the body language of characters. I love watching you work, even if you're not saying a word. Oh. Like in anything you do. I mean, I remember being taken by you in A River Runs Through It before I ever knew that was you.
Thank you.
But I do see, well, maybe is it this? Because going back to Casserole Club, I remember Sugar had these particular shoes. And did you feel like when you put them on, like were the shoes part of like the channel, the funnel into how that she would walk?
Yes, the shoes in relationship to the length of her dress, which was just below her crotch line, just below. And yet you had to make that totally unvulgar because Sugar was disguising something. Do you know what I mean? She was containing herself a bit, right? But so yeah, that was a big thing. And the hairdo of that was major for me because, you know, I have this sort of wild hair and she had this coiffed hair that kind of was all, you know, was long, but gathered on the top of her head, you know, with you know, seemingly something underneath the gather on the top of her head that made it pile up even higher. So you also had to kind of walk and balance that a little bit, you know? And yeah, I remember you sent me this box of sort of period clothes, often that were, you know, size 12. And I was probably a size 4 or 6 at the time. And so I just went to this tailor and we cut them all down and sort of created the shapes of them and all these great polyester, fabulous clothes, actually, and kind of put them. But, you know, it's going back to River Runs Through It that you mentioned. I had this great meeting with Robert Redford where he read to me out of the book of A River Runs Through It. And when they'd sent me the script, I was like, you know, I don't know how to audition for this part. I am 100% interested in this, but I don't know how to actually pull this off in an audition because it's less about the words than the body language. And so Elizabeth Lustig, who is this wonderful casting director, she said, she was a French woman. She said, "Oh, well, okay, well, I don't know. Just come to the meeting and maybe you try to tell that to Redford and see what happens." And I'm like, "Oh, thanks a lot." Like I thought maybe she could get me out of auditioning for it, right? And so we just hit it off and we talked all about. He read to me from the book and we just had this wonderful meeting. And then suddenly he caught himself like. We'd been talking for about 40 minutes about the project and life and all different things. And he said, "Okay, well, what do you want to do now? Do you want to read some?" And I said, "Well, you know, I would love to read to you with you, but I'm a bit concerned about just reading this." And he just looked at me like, "Are you crazy?" And I thought, oh, wow, I just had this job and I just lost it. And then I said, "Well, what I mean is the part where there's a part where Brad Pitt comes to shake her hand through the window, and she's in the passenger seat, and he reaches in across Stephen Shellen, the actor whose character Buster was driving, and Brad Pitt reaches into Stephen Shellen's introducing us, the Buster character is introducing us, and instead of reaching out my hand, I get out of the car to walk all the way around to shake his hand. And then upon getting out of the car, she falls on the ground flat because, you know, she's drunk and then has to walk all the way around the car. And by the time she's to him, it's like she's reaching for a life raft. Like, would somebody please keep her up straight? And so I sort of demonstrated that for Bob Redford in the meeting. And he was like, "All right, well, I'll see you in Montana." Like, yes.
Awesome.
And so, but then because you said shoes, it's just amazing, Steve. You get right to it. You know me so well. Gotten the job, and I was like, "Oh fuck! How am I going to do this?" Like, I just got cast in A River Runs Through It. This is extraordinary. And I hadn't been in any giant movies, you know, or big movies on that scale yet, I don't think. And maybe one or something. But the costumer said, "Well, why don't we go? There's a great place for cowboy boots. Let's go will you come there and, find a pair that really fits you. So we were trying them on, and they were used cowboy boots, because there was period stuff, right? And I found one where someone had walked, putting all their weight on their big toes, sort of that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I suddenly walked in them, and I thought, oh, this is so great. So me playing against the way this person has imprinted these shoes is not dissimilar to, when you don't have to play drunk. I have to try to play sober. I have to try to walk upright in these boots. So it did like half the work for me, those shoes.
Were you?
I still have Sugar's little heels, by the way.
Oh, that's great.
She had little kitten heels. I still have them. And I actually pulled them out. I wore them, I think, at Thanksgiving this year.
Oh, amazing. I would be a little nervous, though, if I showed up and you had the whole get up and the hair up. Like,
I didn't do the hairdo or the short dress either.
Were you always writing throughout your life, or was there a period when you sort of found it?
I think writing was an aid to me to actually overcome what might be oncoming depression. When I was a kid, I remember writing songs, and that's something that, and very briefly, but it made me feel so high. I can't even tell you. There was a teacher at my school in like third grade, and you could meet with the piano teacher and bring your own song, and she would put music to it. And I wrote a song, which in retrospect was a complete ripoff of a Beatles song, right? So it's totally unoriginal, but it made me feel so high writing it. And then Mrs. Lamar was her name, and she put music to it, and we sang my song, and it was like, help, I need somebody. Like, I didn't know help with the big Beatles song, but then there was like, well, I got out a map and did some exploring for me. It was like, and it was just like this opening to the rest of the world. But then in high school, I remember I wrote a short story, totally taken from a scene between my grandmother and her friend who had come to play home movies, and showed my grandmother, who was in her young sexiness, with my grandfather, who was no longer alive when we watched these home movies. And my grandmother was now a completely girdled and coiffed and, dentured woman, you know what I mean? Who was all holding together, this very big woman, all holding it in. But then she was like wearing sort of a silk something that was all soft. And Leona, her friend, was this loud woman in a yellow polyester suit. And she kept saying, don't you feel special, Edna? Don't you feel special? And this just blew my mind. I felt like I'd entered a Flannery O'Connor story or something, and I wrote it down and I submitted it. And my English teacher at Westlake said, well, you should send this to a publisher. This is an extraordinary story. And I gave it to my mother to read. And I said, my teacher thinks this can be published. And my mother, who was one of the most creatively supportive people I will ever know, she said, it's not yet ready for publishing, Susan. So I can say that shut me down a little bit, but what she was really saying to me is, this is a lot of work. And do you know what I mean? And then she circled back around, and we had more of that conversation. But I'll tell you, she died in a car accident when I was 19. So the next thing I can remember of writing, well, I started writing screenplays. I was writing some short movies. I was at film school, my first year of film school, the year she died. And so I was writing short films to make, because that's what you did then. And I wasn't sort of doing prose. But when she died, one of the ways I really processed my grief is I would just write these short stories about feelings I was having. And I would just scribble them out madly. And it was such a comfort for me that I could really articulate the feelings, because in life, it was so extraordinarily damaging that I think I was in a complete state of shock and very interested in holding myself up and not falling apart. I was so scared without her, you know? So it was so special to take. I just remember like conversations I had with some of her friends after she died, or feelings that I might fall apart completely, and to put them into story form was so healing and helpful. And I keep them hidden. I would never let anybody read them. But I knew that if all else failed in that box, I had my feelings. You know, I put them all in this box. And that was really great. And then to heal my anxiety and depression of not knowing if I was ever going to get an acting job later on, I would come into this very room that I'm sitting on. But I mean, for years in between, actually, because I'd written stuff before, but I'd write scripts and I would just put them in the closet for later on, because I was fully engaged in being an actor, you know, and, but it was my way of passing time, really, right? That it wasn't about like, when am I going to make these or anything like that. It was literally to keep me from falling in, you know, to what I feared would be depression. I don't think I really suffered from depression, but I feared that it was going to become a problem. And this kind of kept me moving. Do you know what I mean? In a strange way. And, you know, it wasn't until like the 90s, I think, that my husband, Jesse Dillon, he said, Susan, you've written all those scripts. Why don't you make one of them? It's time for you to make one of those scripts you have. And I literally went into that closet right there and I opened it up and I started pulling them out and thought, which one can I make? And of course, this is long story short, or maybe too long for your own good. But I did make that movie. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it probably, from that moment, it probably took a couple of years to get it made, right? To get it made. And I directed it and I was in it and I produced it with the help of many people, including Jesse. Really was, you know, she just kept saying, you got to do it. You got to do it. And it was just really one of the most generous thing that he'd never, I don't think he'd read much of the stuff, but I think he somehow, you know, lived with me and saw how much strength writing gave me, you know, in a quiet way. And he's like, it's time to bring it out into the world. And, you know, I'm still quietly practicing bringing things out into the world. I don't mind my creativity being a little bit of a secret.
Was this Welcome to California?
Yeah, it was.
You know, that is so beautiful and is one of the pivotal moments in my life. And I'll tell you why. I think I've told you this before, but I'm going to tell you again if I have. Or if I haven't, here it goes. It was after we'd made Firecracker, and there was a period of time between film and digital where digital didn't look good, really, right? And it was still like too much video. And I was technically unaware of what was out there, you know, on the market or whatever. And when I saw your movie, it looked so beautiful. I was like, how is this possible? And I thought, oh, there's this new camera and it treats it like film. And I said, oh, this could be possible for me to continue making movies. And it was so beautifully shot, and the composition in it, and your performance was incredible, and everybody was great. I mean, it was all hands down incredible.
And there was Paul Ryan, the very sage cinematographer. He was a photographer and a cinematographer, and he'd worked doing skiing stuff and landscape stuff with Terrence Malick. And do you know what I mean? He did a lot of, you know, work of going out in the world and photographing stuff for Terrence Malick. And he was extraordinary. He really helped make that really beautiful. Yeah. I mean, he totally listened to my aesthetic, you know what I mean? And what, because other than writing nature, really, was and gathering of people and connections, which we must come back to you on that front, kept me afloat from these strange sort of tragedies that my mother dying and then my father dying when I was quite young, and I had grown up in such a safe, creative life, it's such a world of, that everything going on that is so weird that, so I'm mumbling a bit, but nature also. And it was great that Paul really understood how to make those connections of nature and character and,
and then,
and taught me so much,
Totally. And when, someone so skilled at their craft can then know how to capture that, it's so beautiful just watching it happen.
Thank you, Steve. I want to say, since I am talking about this thing is I do want to take this moment, and I don't mean this as an end, because I hope you have more things you want to talk about. But I before we get away from it, on this front of nature and family, who is supportive, both my natural birth family and my chosen family, and writing and creativity. You have been such a lifeline for me because you've offered me so many wonderful parts. And I mean, I don't know if part of that spoiled me so much that I didn't think I needed to be, ambitious and, jamming to get the next job, because I just enjoyed every experience with you so much. And I think we have such a wonderful language of working together that it's just always been so fulfilling to me. I mean, at times I was like, oh, poor Steve, he must want to work with some other actors too, which you have. But, there were a couple moments of that. But I feel like so grateful that you saw something in me to invite into your movies and to trust me with some of those characters and to invite me into your way of working, which was, we don't need 50 people to do this. And 150 people to do it, or $150 million. And like, let's just, how can we actually make this movie? And, sometimes that can get very sloppy, cutting too many corners, but you are so distilled and distinctive in what you're after that there's never any feeling like this is going to break. You know what I mean? I remember working on one of your movies and I thought, well, we had to shoot the whole thing in 2 weeks. And I had just finished a movie that, we would spend, 5 days shooting a scene. Right. Yeah. So I remember thinking, like, how are we actually going to do this in this period of time? Well, by the end of the movie, when I went back to the other movie or to another movie that was that, I was like, what are we going to do with all this time? You know what I mean? You're so open and collaborative, but never lose yourself in that collaboration. And the strength of that in you is so liberating for an actor. And we've also written something together too that I could, with Anselm also. But I always knew that was yours, that movie, and that I was just bringing what I could bring to it, but that you would make it what you wanted it to be. And I love that as an actor, that I can go off and really move into the character, but as collaborative and as inviting you are. You never, you always hold your ground. And that's so liberating, to have that net of safety, both in the moment and in my entire life of you just keep coming back and going, well, do you want to work on this with me? Do you want to work on this with me? And I'm just like, yes, because it's hard out there getting things done.
It is.
Yeah.
I love
and you've really taught me that you can, you can get anything done, if it's worthy of being done, you can get it done,
Filmmaker Susan Traylor. Another great Filmmaking Confidential guest is Jennifer Grace.
When you're in rehearsal for any show, what you're doing is you're putting together the blueprints of a house. You've plotted out these rooms. I'm gonna go in the living room, I'm gonna go in the dining room, and I'm gonna go upstairs, and I'm gonna go downstairs. You've got all that stuff plotted out, right? You'll find in a long run that you will go sometimes to go into the room that you always go into, and the handle doesn't work. You can't get in there because it's getting rickety, it's getting worn down. Your job as an actor is get in that fucking room.
You can hear my full interview with Jennifer at filmmakingconfidential.com in our archives or by subscribing for free to this podcast. We'll be right back with Susan Traylor. Stay with us. I'm back with Susan Traylor.
Once you've worked with someone, you have like an unspoken language. And then when you work with them again, the unspoken language part of it becomes even stronger. So I remember the first time I was aware of it with you was when I was my own cinematographer for Casserole Club. And I remember instinctively moving the camera at the exact same moment you were instinctively moving. It was as if we'd rehearsed it or we had the choreography planned and designed, but it wasn't. It was all just instinctively happening. And it was like I was so tapped into you as a performer that I could almost anticipate it on an unconscious level.
Was that at that dinner table with the wine glass?
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that moment too. I remember.
It's so great. And
or
I
maybe
think
you told it to me right afterwards. Is that?
Yeah.
So now I was like, oh, right. Yeah.
But, don't you think that it happens only after really working with someone more than, or has that ever happened for you on the first time?
Let's just say that is totally true and totally special, and I think there was also moments where we could also like end a cut and look at each other and know we'd gone off totally in the wrong direction, and we wouldn't have to say it, and you'd go, okay, one more, let's go again. And we'd be like, whoops. But we were both out, you know what I mean? And yeah. I loved that. So it wasn't like, we wouldn't even need to stop and revisit where we were going to go. Right. It was just like, should we try it again? Yes. And we both knew where we were out.
Totally. What was it like working with Karen Black?
Well, first of all, I'm so it's so great that you asked me to do Firecracker and you said Karen Black was going to be in it. I was such a fan of Karen Black's from when I was a kid. I don't know. I had seen her in The Day of the Locust, and there was just something about it that I thought, what is that? I mean, that's extraordinary. So the idea that I was going to get to work with her was incredible to me. And I'm not sure I'd thought about her a whole lot in between. Of course, in 5 Easy Pieces and The Great Gatsby, right? I mean, there were all these things that somehow her performances really hit me a lot, right? And so I was so excited, and I remember I got to Kansas, and we had a few days to prep and figure things out, and we were figuring out wardrobe and costumes there and everything. So I got out of my hotel room, and I thought, well, remember, I was playing a sheriff in a time period where it was slightly unbelievable to me that a woman would be the sheriff, except for there was Anne, who really had been the sheriff, right, in the town. So I got to meet her, and that was incredible. But I was like, okay, I just have to figure out the hairdo. That was one of those things, is how am I going to externalize this part? I'd sort of figured out some of the clothes, yes, I think we'd figured out the clothes. I was like, but what is the hairdo going to be? But I decided to go out in the town and see if I couldn't find some hairdos. Because what year is that?
We filmed it?
Yeah.
We filmed it in 2003, but it was still, that town has been trapped in time for decades.
Well, that's what I was going to say. In the diners and in some of the shops and stuff, you could still find people who had hairdos that were 20 years old, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I went on foot through the town, and I went into this antique mall, you know, those antique malls where everybody has a stall. And I thought, yeah, I'm gonna just listen to the people in here talking, the people who work here, see if I can't find a hairdo. And if not, I'm gonna head to the diner. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
yeah. Start here. And I was wandering around looking through it, looking for people in there. It was a big place. And I see this woman sitting there knitting and talking with someone who worked there. And my mouth just dropped, and it was Karen Black. And she was sitting in the same antique mall that I had gone to on my first day of arriving there, right? And she was knitting. And she looked up at me and she said, yes. And I was like, oh, I don't want to interrupt you, but I'm Susan and I'm doing this movie with you. And, and she said, oh, well, I'm just here practicing my dialogue. I found that she introduced me to the woman who worked there. And she said, I'm my accent, she said, I'm just sitting here working, copying her, learning her accent. And I said, that's so funny because I'm here looking for hairdos.
Oh, that's so good.
And then cut to, it's one of the only times this has ever happened to me. But do you remember when I come in and I find her like in the room, in the closet,
yes,
sort of closing the closet door. And then she looks at me and she doesn't want me to know what's in the closet. Right. Is that?
Yeah.
Yes. Right? And we were doing a whole dialogue scene together. And I got totally thrown out because I realized this woman, like I just did a full head to toe on her going, every bit of her is in this because she wasn't the woman who was sitting practicing her accent the other day. Right. And all the way from the top of her head. And I did a full body scan in the middle of our scene. Right. And I looked down at her toes and they were suddenly turned in this different way that I'd known a lot, some Midwestern, as I told you, my father grew up in Missouri. So
yeah,
I'd been aware of this before. And I suddenly saw how Karen Black had her feet stuffed into these shoes that almost poured out of them and pointed inward in a way that was not Karen Black. And I was like, every pore of her body is in this. And I hear this cut. I think my mouth just dropped open. And I was like, I'm really sorry. I just got taken out. But yeah, that was, I think in a nutshell, that was working with her. She was, wow, incredible.
What makes you curious?
What makes me curious is such a great question, Steve, because one of the things, when they ask you that question, what don't you like in a person? It drives me insane when people lack curiosity. So I don't know what makes me curious, but it is my driving force. What makes things work? I'm curious about what makes things work. I can't say I ever understand it, but I suppose it really, going back to your initial question of what it was like being raised in a creative family, I was so, my parents were acting teachers, and sometimes they directed plays and they go to work as an actor. But I was so and all the people around me who were working, the grownups around me, they shared their process. And like I said, all these different personalities who approach their process in different ways. I think that just became, I don't know if I was born that way, but I was certainly born into that's something that's interesting in life. When my family and I would go to restaurants, a game my father would have us play, how you try to keep the kids entertained at restaurants.
Yeah.
He would pick someone in the restaurant and he'd say, okay, that man over there in the blue jacket, who is he? Where is he from? And what does he do with his life? Tell me about it. And we'd have to go around the table and we would all design come up with our version of who he was. Then someone from the table would be elected to go over and ask the man if he could come over and tell us about himself. And sometimes people would not want to talk to us, but oftentimes people would be so turned on that this is what we were doing and so excited. But I tell this story to say that I think it's just part of how I was raised. It was talking about what was going on, what went on with your day, what's going on with this, why did someone react this way, what was the subtext of everything. I remember my sister had a friend from Westlake School for Girls come out to her. She was spending the night at our house in Malibu. She had dinner with her whole family, and can't remember what we were talking about, but the girl finally went, "Oh my God, you guys are so strange. You guys talk about everything. I mean, I think I love it, but I've never seen anything like this before." And she picked up the fork and she said, "I'm sure you guys could do an hour on this fork."
Oh, that's so good.
Yeah.
That's so good. I love that game. I forgot you had told me about that game. We should play that sometime.
Let's play it.
Were there any other things, other games or other?
My mother, a great note. I once saw her watch a scene. Here's a couple, but that she would say, "Oh, okay, this is great. Now I want you to go out to LAX. Just watch people. It's a great place. You need to watch people. You need to get interested. See how many different people you can see there, And she said, you'll see people from all over the world there. You just need to spend time. Just spend a couple of hours. Go there a few times. Just watch people. Watch how people are going on to a plane and watch people coming out to a plane. And from that, it's something I would do at airports. I would just sit there and watch people. And, I couldn't not watch people coming off a plane because their families would be waiting for them. And remember, they used to hold up those signs like, "Welcome home, Tommy,"
Yeah.
And they'd all be hugging and crying to see each other. And by the time at baggage claim, they'd all be rolling their eyes like, "Oh God, him again," And that was so upsetting to me that I would just sob in the airport, sob. So that was a good one. And then, a note that I loved, but she watched someone do a scene and she said, "Okay, this is you've put in a lot of work to this. Now I want you to go to, museum. There's the painting of," she'd name a specific painting. She was like, "Go spend some time with that painting and then work on this scene some more." That was a great, it wasn't a note to me. It was to somebody else. So I'm losing the details, but those were, I wouldn't call them tricks, but I think they were engaging people in the process of going deeper, being more curious, discovery, making connections to things, My father, I remember I was going to do the seagull in class. I was in high school and he was driving me and had my school uniform on. I said, "Dad, I'm so afraid, I have to break down in tears." I just am afraid. I can be upset, but I don't know if I can actually cry. And he initiated an argument to me until I was sobbing. And he said, "What? How could you tell me you don't know how to cry? Look at yourself." I said, "Thanks, Dad."
Amazing.
He goes, "Forget the rest of it." It's like, "You're a beautiful crier." And, that got me over the hump that was, I don't know, somehow it had become a thing of like, am I going to know how to? And I never thought about it again, because cry,
Yeah.
It just works.
That's so good.
Coming in at the beginning of the seagull, right? Out of breath. "Well, I'm not late. Surely I'm not late," is the line, right? And, there was a time where my dad had me go down the stairs of their acting studio, down to the next block. He's like, "I want you to go up to," it was between first and second. He said, "I want you to go to First and La Brea and run all the way down the block and up the stairs before you come in here. I was like, what, you want to wait for me to do that? He goes, go do it. So that I was really out of breath instead of pretending to be out of breath. And then from that, you then get, out of breath means, then you don't have to do it every time, but you had to do it a few times. He made me do it.
Yeah.
It was totally humiliating, but it just broke that down. It's like, you really, I think he was teaching me that you have to find it first before you can put it on.
Ladies and gentlemen, Susan Traylor. Tune in next time for more Filmmaking Confidential. It is totally free to subscribe, and when you subscribe, you'll get upcoming new episodes automatically, and you'll have free access to all our past shows. The Filmmaking Confidential podcast is a production of Dekanga Audio and produced by myself and Ella Spencer. Our original theme music is composed by Kevin Robles. For more of the Filmmaking Confidential podcast, head over to filmmakingconfidential.com. If you have a question about filmmaking you'd like me to answer on the podcast, send me an email using the contact form on the website. To learn more of my filmmaking secrets, be sure to pick up a copy of the book, Filmmaking Confidential, available on Audible, paperback, and ebook, wherever books are sold. I'm Steve Balderson. Thanks for listening and spreading the word. Until next time, keep making, keep doing, keep going.